years ago, I worked the late shift at a small, independently owned pharmacy. It was a job I enjoyed, despite the odd hours. The quiet of the store after dark was something I had grown accustomed to, and there was a certain peace in the routine of stocking shelves, assisting the occasional late-night customer, and closing up alone. However, one night, a routine shift turned into an experience that still sends chills down my spine whenever I think about it. It was a Friday night, and the pharmacy had been unusually quiet. The lull in customer traffic gave me plenty of time to restock shelves, organize the back room, and tidy up the store. Around 11 p.m., with only an hour left before closing, I was busy replenishing the over-the-counter medications in aisle 4. The store's fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow over the rows of products, and the only sounds were the soft hum of the air conditioner and the occasional crinkle of packaging as I placed items back on the shelves. As I reached for a box of cold medicine on a high shelf, I had the unsettling feeling that I was being watched. I glanced up and froze. At the far end of the aisle, partially obscured by the shelves, stood a man. He was staring directly at me, his eyes locked on mine in a way that made my skin crawl. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. His face was shadowed, but I could see the intensity in his gaze. Startled, I quickly looked away and tried to focus on my task, hoping he would move on. But when I looked up again a few moments later, he was still there, his eyes fixed on me with an unnerving intensity. My heart began to race, and a sense of unease settled over me. The pharmacy was empty except for the two of us, and his behavior was anything but normal. I moved to the next aisle, trying to shake off the feeling and distract myself with work. But as I turned the corner, I saw him again, now standing at the end of the new aisle, still staring. It was as if he had anticipated my movements, and the way he appeared and disappeared around the store made me feel like a mouse being stalked by a cat. Every time I moved, he seemed to find a new vantage point from which to watch me, never saying a word, never approaching, just watching. I considered going to the register area where there was a phone, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. Maybe he was just a customer who was too shy or uncertain to ask for help, I told myself. Still, the longer he lingered without purchasing anything, the more my nerves began to fray. By the time midnight approached, I was more than ready to close up and leave. I went to the front of the store, trying to act natural, and began the closing routine. I announced over the intercom that the store was closing, hoping that the man would take the hint and leave. I didn't want to confront him, but I didn't want him hanging around either. To my relief, he seemed to leave. I watched him walk toward the entrance, and the automatic doors slid open to let him out into the night. I exhaled, feeling a small wave of relief wash over me. But that relief was short-lived. As I locked the doors and turned off the lights, I glanced out of the large glass windows that overlooked the parking lot. There, parked directly in front of the store, was the man's car. The headlights were off, but the faint glow from the streetlights revealed his silhouette behind the wheel. He was just sitting there, facing the store, watching. A cold dread settled over me as I realized he hadn't left at all. He was waiting. I considered my options. I could call the police, but what would I tell them? That a man had been staring at me and was now sitting in his car? It sounded ridiculous, and I doubted they would take me seriously. I could leave, but that meant walking right past his car to get to mine, which was parked at the far end of the lot. The idea of walking out there alone with him watching my every move was terrifying. Instead, I decided to stay inside. I pretended to keep cleaning, though the store was already spotless. I moved slowly, meticulously wiping down counters and organizing shelves, all while keeping one eye on the man's car outside. Every few minutes I would glance up, only to see him still there, motionless, watching. Minutes turned into an hour, and still, he didn't move. The parking lot, usually bustling during the day, was eerily silent. The only other car in the lot belonged to me, and the emptiness amplified the feeling of isolation. I felt like I was trapped in a cage, with the man outside as my silent, menacing captor. As the clock ticked closer to 1 a.m., I began to wonder how long he would wait. Was he hoping I would leave the store so he could follow me? Was he planning something more sinister? My mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw him move. He started the car, and for a brief moment I thought he might drive away. But instead, he just sat there with the engine idling, headlights off, as if he was trying to outweight me. I decided to wait him out, hoping he would lose interest and leave. I stayed inside the store, cleaning the same shelves over and over again, trying to appear calm even as my nerves were stretched to their limit. At long last, the man put the car in gear and slowly pulled out of the parking lot. I watched as he turned onto the main road and disappeared into the night. It was only when his taillights faded into the distance that I finally allowed myself to breathe. I stayed in the store for another 10 minutes just to be sure he was really gone. When I was certain he wasn't coming back, I quickly locked up, dashed to my car, and drove home as fast as I could, my eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror for any sign of his car. I never saw the man again, but the memory of that night still haunts me. The way he watched me with such intensity, the way he waited in his car as if he had all the time in the world, it was the most unnerving experience of my life. Even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling of being watched whenever I'm alone in a public place. That night taught me a valuable lesson about staying vigilant and trusting my instincts, but it also left me with a lingering sense of unease that I carry with me to this day. It was a Thursday evening, one of those nights when the world feels a little heavier and the fluorescent lights in the grocery store buzz a little louder than usual. After a long day at work, I decided to stop by the grocery store to pick up a few things before heading home. The parking lot was half empty, and the faint orange glow from the street lights barely cut through the encroaching darkness. There was something eerie about the stillness in the air, a silence that made the rustling of leaves seem unnaturally loud. I grabbed a cart and made my way inside, the automatic doors sliding shut behind me with a soft hiss. The store was quiet, almost deserted, with only a few other shoppers meandering through the aisles. I began my usual routine, moving from aisle to aisle, checking off items from my mental list. The comforting repetition of grocery shopping usually helped me unwind, but tonight, something felt off. As I rounded the corner into the pasta aisle, I noticed a man standing at the far end, seemingly engrossed in reading the labels on a box of spaghetti. He was tall and lanky, with a scruffy beard and a worn baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. His clothes were plain, an old jacket and faded jeans, but there was something about him that caught my attention. Maybe it was the way he seemed to linger a little too long, or the way his eyes flicked up to meet mine as I passed by. I pushed the cart forward, telling myself that I was being paranoid. It was just a random shopper, nothing more. I continued down the aisle, picking up a box of pasta and tossing it into my cart. But as I moved on to the next aisle, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Sure enough, as I turned into the cereal aisle, there he was again, standing at the far end, this time pretending to browse the shelves. His presence was unsettling, a shadow that seemed to follow me wherever I went. I started to speed up, moving from aisle to aisle more quickly, hoping to lose him. But no matter where I went, he always seemed to reappear, hovering nearby, his eyes never leaving me. My heart began to race, and a knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach. I tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, that he was simply on a similar shopping route. But the more I thought about it, the more the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I decided to cut my shopping trip short, grabbing only the essentials and heading toward the checkout. As I approached the register, I glanced back and was relieved to see the man heading toward the exit. For a brief moment, I felt a sense of relief, thinking that the strange encounter was finally over. I quickly paid for my groceries, eager to leave the store and put the unsettling experience behind me. But as I walked out into the parking lot, my relief quickly turned to dread. There, parked in the shadows near the exit, was a van. The engine was running, and through the tinted windows I could just make out the silhouette of someone sitting inside. It was the same man. He was just sitting there, staring straight ahead, his figure barely visible in the dim light. Panic set in as I realized that I had been right all along. He had been following me. I considered walking straight to my car, loading my groceries, and driving away as fast as I could. But the idea of passing by his van, so close and vulnerable, made my skin crawl. Every instinct screamed at me to avoid him, to put as much distance between us as possible. Instead of heading to my car, I turned on my heel and walked back into the store, my heart pounding in my chest. Once inside, I pretended to browse near the front entrance, all the while keeping a close eye on the parking lot through the glass doors. I watched the van, waiting for it to move, hoping that he would just drive away. Minutes passed, each one stretching out longer than the last. My mind raced with thoughts of what he might do if I went outside. Was he waiting for me specifically, or was it just another strange coincidence? The uncertainty was maddening, and I could feel the panic rising in my throat. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the van pulled out of its parking spot and slowly drove away. I watched it until it disappeared from sight, only then allowing myself to exhale. My hands were shaking as I clutched the cart, my knuckles white. I waited a few more minutes to be sure he was gone before cautiously heading back to my car. Even as I loaded my groceries and drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided something terrible. The entire drive, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the van trailing behind me. But the road remained empty and I finally pulled into my driveway, my nerves still frayed. That night I found it impossible to sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside made my heart leap in my chest. I kept replaying the events in my mind, trying to make sense of what had happened, but all I could feel was a deep, gnawing unease. For weeks afterward, the memory of that night haunted me. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder whenever I went out, especially in parking lots. The experience had left a scar, a lingering sense of vulnerability that I couldn't quite shake. Even now, I can't step into a grocery store without feeling a twinge of anxiety, a reminder of the man in the van who never said a word, but left a lasting mark on my psyche. It was a chilly afternoon, and I found myself in need of a few groceries, so I decided to visit a small local grocery store that I didn't frequent often. The store had a quaint, almost nostalgic feel to it, with narrow aisles and shelves that were slightly overstocked, the kind of place where the staff knew most of the regular customers by name. As I walked in, the bell above the door jingled, and the warm, cozy atmosphere inside was a welcome contrast to the cold outside. I grabbed a basket and began my shopping, moving slowly through the aisles as I picked up the items I needed. There was something comforting about the store's old-fashioned charm, and for a while I was lost in the simple task of selecting fresh produce and deciding between different brands of pasta. But then, as I was reaching for a can of soup, I noticed someone standing a little too close. I glanced up and saw a woman with disheveled hair and wrinkled clothes. She was tall and thin, with hollow cheeks and dark circles under her eyes. At first, I thought she was just another shopper, but there was something about her that made me uneasy. Her eyes were fixed on me, and she didn't seem to be paying attention to the shelves or the items around her. I tried to brush it off, assuming she was simply lost in thought or distracted by something on her mind. But as I continued my shopping, I couldn't help but notice that she seemed to be following me. Every time I turned a corner, she was there, lingering a few feet behind me, her eyes never leaving me. I started to feel uncomfortable, my initial sense of warmth and safety replaced by a growing sense of unease. I quickened my pace, hoping to lose her by moving through the store more quickly, but she matched my speed, always staying just close enough to make her presence known. It was as if she was studying me, observing my every move, and it made my skin crawl. By the time I reached the dairy section, my heart was pounding in my chest. I glanced over my shoulder and saw her standing at the end of the aisle, staring at me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. I decided then and there that I needed to leave the store as quickly as possible. I hurried to the checkout, trying not to look back, but I could feel her eyes on me the entire time. As I placed my items on the conveyor belt, I finally dared to glance over my shoulder. To my relief, she was no longer there. I paid for my groceries, grabbed my bags, and practically sprinted out of the store. The cold air hit me like a slap in the face as I stepped outside, but I was too rattled to care. I quickly made my way to my car, glancing around the parking lot to make sure the woman wasn't following me. Seeing nothing suspicious, I got in my car, locked the doors, and took a deep breath. The feeling of unease lingered, but I told myself that it was over, that I was just being paranoid. The drive home was uneventful, and by the time I pulled into my driveway, I had almost convinced myself that I had overreacted. But as I got out of the car and glanced across the street, my heart sank. Parked directly across from my house was a car, and inside I could see the same woman, her wild hair unmistakable. She was just sitting there, staring at my house with those dark, unblinking eyes. A cold wave of fear washed over me. How had she found out where I lived? Had she followed me all the way home? Or had she somehow known where I lived beforehand? The questions swirled in my mind, each one more disturbing than the last. I quickly hurried inside, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I put the groceries away, and I couldn't stop glancing out the window to see if she was still there. But she never moved, just sat in her car, watching. That night I tried to go about my usual routine, but I couldn't relax. Every little noise made me jump, and I found myself constantly peering through the curtains, half expecting to see her standing outside. Hours passed, and I finally managed to drift off to sleep, though it was a fitful, restless sleep filled with uneasy dreams. But in the middle of the night, I awoke with a start. Something had disturbed me, though I wasn't sure what. I lay in bed for a moment, listening to the silence, when I heard a faint scratching sound coming from outside. My heart leaped into my throat as I realized it was coming from the window. I got out of bed as quietly as I could, my pulse racing, and cautiously approached the window. My hands were trembling as I reached for the curtain, and I hesitated for a moment, terrified of what I might see on the other side. But I had to know. With a quick motion, I pulled back the curtain, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There, pressed against the glass, was the woman's face, her wild hair framing her wide, unblinking eyes. She was so close that I could see the fog from her breath on the glass, her eyes filled with a strange, manic intensity. I screamed and stumbled backward, my heart pounding in terror. I quickly turned on the lights, hoping to scare her off, and when I looked back, she was gone. I rushed to the window and saw her sprinting to her car. She jumped in and sped off into the night, her taillights disappearing around the corner. Shaken and terrified, I called the police and reported the incident. They arrived quickly, but by the time they searched the area, she was long gone. They took my statement and assured me they would keep an eye out for her, but there wasn't much they could do without more information. For weeks afterward, I lived in a state of constant fear, jumping at every shadow and every sound. I kept the curtains drawn tight and double-checked the locks on all the doors and windows every night. I never saw the woman again, but the memory of her face at my window haunted me, leaving me feeling paranoid and unsafe in my own home. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that she's still out there somewhere, watching and waiting. The experience left a scar on my psyche, a lingering sense of dread that I can't seem to shake. I no longer feel safe in my own home, and every time I hear a noise outside, I can't help but wonder if she's come back to finish what she started.